They had wrapped him in rough spun and oiled cloth, as if the oil could keep him from the reach of the cold, as if the smell of pitch and tallow could make the body less a body, more a thing to be handled and set aside. The breath of the room was smoky and red. Candles guttered in the drafts that found their way even into the Lord Commander's chamber. He lay on the board they used for the dead, the black wood stained with countless old washings, and the carved-into surface had a slight give where old cuts had found it. The first sound he knew again was the scratch of ghosts' claws on stone, an impatient rhythm with a space in it like a missing heartbeat. From far away he remembered the snow on his cheeks and the knives. The faces he knew turned foreign as they looked down on him, and the cold that took him. He remembered how all sound had folded into a shape that was not silence, because it had pattern to it, and how the world had retreated into a single point he could not move toward or away from. And in that point, a colorless light, not rosy nor golden nor white, but a thin light like moon on frost. The light had a flavor. He tasted iron. He tasted old wood. He tasted something that was like the memory of the first breath taken in winter. When his eyes opened, the room seemed two rooms at once, the half-lit one he knew, and another that lay precisely on top of it, altered only by stillness and a faint slow lattice of ice lines that streaked the air and walls. He saw them the way one sees the wefted cloth when they hold it to the light. The lines ran in patient designs and bent in the corners and gathered in knots at the classes of the shutters and in the cracks between stones and the bellies of the candles. In the other room the flames did not move. They were shapes fixed inside themselves. He blinked, and the two rooms struggled and then knit again into one, and he felt his breath move, and the terrible dry ache in his chest where a life had ended and another had been laid in its place. He drew that first breath like a man who knows it will cost him. The candles acknowledged it. Their flames lifted slim and blue. Somewhere he heard a low sound like wind throttled in a tube. Ghost's muzzle appeared on the edge of the board, teeth bared in a grin that was not a grin, just the shape of a wolf's cheeks when they are glad and do not know they are glad. John touched the wolf's head by memory. The fur under his palm was not warm at first. He had to work at the thought that it should be warm. Then it was, under his hand, soft and rough where old burrs had pulled at it, warm as fire kept in a body. The taste of iron receded. A woman's voice spoke words that were not for him. He did not understand them. Understanding wasn't the right word for what they did. The sounds of them arrived to him as notes like frost settling on a latch, and he saw again the doubled room as a stone bowl carved with spiral scratches. The red woman stood with her hands wet to the forearms in water that steamed only a little, where it should have roiled. Davos Seaworth was at the foot, his mouth a firm line, his eyes waiting for him to be one thing or another. Dolorous Ed had his shoulders hunched so high they were almost a cloak. Tormund smelt like damp hair and cured meat and refusal. Snow. Tormund's voice arrived as the world returned to itself, all the seams fussing into place, and the old air of the room, sweat and wood smoke and the faint sourness of rushes used too long, came back as well. Flamebeard did it, or the wolf did it, or you did it yourself because stubborn crows die last. John tried to speak and lost the thread of his tongue. The first sound that came was a dry scrape caught in his teeth. He tried again. He found it hard to fit the word. Cold. We know that part, said Ed. We keep a fair account of the cold up here. It was the other part that was overbold. Melisandre's hands came away from the water, and she looked at him as if he were a small fire she'd set and was watching to see what it burned. There was care in that gaze and calculation both. The ruby at her throat was a small mouth. It pulsed subtly as if it had its own blood. Do you know your name? She asked. John. Felt wrong on his tongue the first moment and then right. Snow. Even that felt thinner than it had been. Do you know your brothers? Davos asked him. He tried to think of the faces at the meeting, the knives moving too fast, the voice that had said the words like a prayer to a simple God. He thought of them and found their names would not sit in their faces. The faces were pale masks in a dark yard. He remembered more strongly the snow that had gone into his throat like the first drink after days without, and how the light at the edge of the world had bent and folded and then made that quiet place. He shook his head once, a small admission. I know you. Good enough, Ed muttered. Better than nothing. Better than the last Lord Commander. After a beat he added more gently, we kept you from the ice as long as we could. John lifted himself. The cut pains sang in a faded way, not as cries, but as if someone rubbed their fingers over old scars, and the scars felt obliged to speak of the old day. Ghost's paw pressed his side with a dog's anxious knowledge of hurt. John learned the room again from that changed height. The fire sat in the grate like a thought placed there to remind them of the South. On the wall hung Longclaw. He knew it at once, though the sword's presence felt at first like an old friend's letter you had not yet opened. When he shifted his legs over the side of the board, the world tilted. Melisandre moved toward him as if to reach, thought better, and only put her palm flat on the wet rim of the back of the chair near the bed. The cold left its print in you, she said, her voice the same measured cadence as always, but the end of it softer. You will feel it. I feel, he groped for a word that wasn't there in the speech he'd lived with. I feel the room, not as it is, as it could be. You sound like a builder, said Ed. The world is built out of what it has and its opposite, Melisandre said. Light draws darkness, heat calls to cold. A man brought back by flame is touched by the absence of it. You have been close to the other. At that word the timber in the ceiling seemed to creak, though it did not. John felt again the delicate net of lines he had glimpsed in the other room on top of the room, and by habit his mind turned toward the wall. It was there, heavy as the rest of the world's ice pressed into a straight line. It had a song, a low iron song. Beneath the song were other sounds, thin as hair, flickers of something that almost was speech and almost was nothing. He had never listened for them before. Now they were present as the yellow in a candle's white. I need air, he said. Not warm air. The other. Now there's a first, said Tormund with an odd respect. And as John arose, the wildling took the lion's share of his weight without making a point of it. Davos went to fetch the cloak that had been his. Ed lifted Longclaw down from the wall without asking and held it out. And the weight of the sword in his hand was the first familiar thing. It steadied him more than the hands that steadied him. They took him to the yard. The sky over the wall was the color of a pale dogfish belly, that underside gray with a faint promise of something brighter that never quite arrived. Men paused in their work to look. The old ones took off caps and rubbed at their ears as if to wake themselves from a dream. The boys gaped. He heard in the looks a question that had not yet found words. Is that a man still? Is that our commander or the ghost of him? John could not answer them. He lifted his head and looked to the wall. That was where the change had its loudest voice. The wall had always been there, a fact. Now it was a mouth. It sang very low, and what it sang were old shapes, the forms of binding and remembrance. There was something loosed beyond it that broke small against the song. He could feel it more than see it. The sensation was like standing at the edge of a river in flood and watching bits of bark and branch and leaves rush at the rope stretched across and slap and twist there. Some of the bits caught for a breath, then slid under and were lost. Some turned away. Some seemed drawn to the rope like iron to a lodestone and stayed clinging and made the rope groan. There, he said without intending to say it. We know that part, Ed said again, but softly. We saw them too many times to doubt. But you say it like you can smell them. I can hear them. Oh, best of all. Ed's mouth did not make a smile, but his eyes did a fraction of the work of one. Hear them what? Their bony knees knocking. They have a kind of speech, John said, listening, and knew even as he said it that speech was a poor word for it. He lifted a hand, and to his surprise the lines within the air he had noticed in his room seemed to answer. It was not like flame when one blows and the flame rolls out and back. It was like tapping at a spider's web and feeling the spiders take notice, the web quiver in recognition of a name. Something far out on the other side of that pale line of ice stilled. It was a small thing, the way if you whistle at a dog you can get one ear from him before you get the dog. John let the shape in him that had woken with the second breathing move, not thinking on it too much. He thought of stillness and of waiting, and he shaped it with his will the way he would shape his body to a horse or a sword. The groan of the wall dropped to a whisper. He felt, not saw, but feeling had turned wide as the world. The press of many bits of bark and bone paws against the rope. In the yard, men turned their faces as if a door had swung open somewhere. Several of the ravens along the wall walk gave hollow croaks like stones dropping down a well. Ghost, whose nose had been at his thigh, went suddenly very still and then looked up at him as if to say, "So you do hear it too? What did you just do?" Tormund asked, half laughter in it. "The hairs on my arms stood like a boy's first night with a woman. I asked them not to move," Jon said, and the strangeness of saying it made him want to laugh himself. The urge died on the edge of his mouth. The moment hung like a crisp-caught breath, and then the world started again with the ordinary noises. The rattle of a gate chain, a cough, a boy swearing under his breath at a dropped tool. Davos exhaled. "You say it as if it were true." He looked up at the wall as if it might disapprove. "How can we have proof of that?" "Find me a hand," Jon said. They looked at him, not understanding. "A hand," he repeated. "We keep them sometimes. A hand that moved on its own. Bring it to me." They brought him the blackened thing in a chest someone had hammered together from broken fence rails and spear pole scraps. A chest that had held other small horrors over years. Ed carried it as if it were nothing, as if he ever believed that since he could die any day, there wasn't a reason to be precious with one more cause of dying. He set it on the trestle near the gate and took off the lid with 2 fingers, slow and cautious as a man who opens a hive. The thing inside was the color of a drowned tree root. It had black nails and blacker crust at the wrist. It twitched in an aimless way, as if remembering. A few men who'd come to see backed away a pace. Tormund leaned in to look at it more closely with the rude curiosity of someone still learning what frightened civilized men. Jon watched it for a count of 10, letting the feel of it find him. The hand's twitching had its own beat. He reached with the new sense, the way one reaches toward a spooked horse, palms open, showing he had no weapon. He thought the shape of stillness at it teach. Way he'd thought it at the great far press beyond the wall. The hand stopped moving. It lay there as any dead thing lies. Ed sighed. "Well, that's a trick." His tone refused to give away awe, but awe peeped between his words. Tormund's eyes raked Jon's face as if measuring it for new rumor. "You frost-tamed it. Call it what you want," Jon said, and did not add that the effort had cost him, because he only realized it when he tried to draw breath and his lungs complained as if he'd run to the top of the wall's stairs and down again. A tickle of cold lay under his ribs. An ache coiled there. When he let the thought go, the hand began to twitch again. A small crossness like a child's foot that never stops swinging under a chair. Melisandre stood very still as well. She had been quiet through it, allowing the men their talk. Now she looked at Jon and said, "Fire has rivals and partners both. If you lean hard on cold, mind what bargains cold will ask. You are not all returned. Something went with your breath into the dark and something came back in its place." Jon swallowed. He knew it, but hearing it said aloud fixed it in the room. He nodded once. "What use?" Davos said, practical as ever. "Forgive a smuggler's prayer, but what use is there in making this hand lie like the dead it should be, unless we mean to spend it as a terror against our own?" "I don't mean to spend it at all," Jon said. "Not if there is another way." The next hours went as such hours go food, which he could taste as if it were made of shapes instead of sweet or salt or savory. The business of getting a man's body back into a soldier's clothing. The quiet relief in ghosts following him room to room as if to herd him back to a life. He slept while the light still held and dreamt of a wide white plain along which slow shadows moved in a deliberate dance. Each step counted and recounted as if it were law itself. He woke to darkness and the sense that the plain had put down roots in him. After, he went with a small party onto the wall. The wind there had teeth as ever. It tried to chew his cheeks and ears, and if he had not been alert, he might have turned his own face away from the cold, thinking himself still the same. He welcomed it instead and let it bite. His breath plumed. 2 guards stood by the east end of the wall walk, their spears upright and eyes over the top. One of them was a boy who had come to the watch because his brother had told him there would be adventure. The boy had met adventure and found it a poor housemate. He stood straighter when John passed. They walked to a point where the ice underfoot thinned a little. The old builders had taught where it did that, and John had learned it and forgotten it in the way of all men who have many burdens. When he looked down through the pale blue, he saw the wall as an old glacier, clouded in places, clear in others, its strange captured leaves and bubbles and stones held in it like thoughts a mind never finished thinking. He shut his eyes. He leaned his hands on the ice and let the cold come up into him, not in a single burst, but as a trickle he could govern. He thought of the plain. He thought of the speech that wasn't speech. He thought of it as one would think of learning a tongue always at the edge of hearing. He sent his intent down into that slow language. Stop. Wait. Hear me. He knew when it reached them. The small pieces, the whites, the lost bones that had been coaxed up and made to walk, the half-rotted and the half-remembered, were easy to quiet. The cold animate in them was a curl of thread, and when he touched it, it fell still as a knot cut. The others, those pale knights, the old ice-sworn, were more dangerous to nudge. He felt them turn the way a stag turns when it knows the arrow has loosed but cannot yet find the wind the arrow is traveling on. The wrong sort of touch would have them rush toward it. He made the touch light, diffused, a weather change rather than a word. The nearest of them lifted its face. He was not seeing it with his eyes, but his mind had contrived a way of making the sensation into an image. It had eyes, pale like the last thin sheet of ice in a basin when spring thinks itself brave and then falters. It held a long slim thing in its hand that had never been a human-made blade. It had a name that was not a name as men understand such things. Knowing that name was like knowing the taste of a stone. The name was not the sound other mouths might make. It was what the thing was to itself. He moved closer to it in that beetle-bright sense. It was asleep and awake at once. It did not have thoughts in rows. Its thinking ran like a frost pattern, branching and branching, returning to the principle of itself. A new law that struck him as true as the bite of iron on a winter tongue. It knew the law of what it served, and it served it as unbendingly as any sworn brother had served his. He understood then that this would not be a matter of coaxing or trickery. It would be a matter of law. He had law of his own. The wall's song inside him, the old shapes, the fact that he had died under oaths and stood up again under them broken and yet unforgotten. He held the shape in his mind as he had on the yard and inclined it toward the white mind that faced him. Stop, he thought, not as a plea, not as a threat, as an instruction flavored like obligation. It looked at him without pupils. The world shifted the way it does when you realize a stranger in a crowd is kin. The other stopped. He slept after that as if the bed were a boat in noisy water. He dreamt of Lyanna, not as he remembered her from childhood when she was a rumor with gray eyes and laughter too loud for ladies, but as she might have been if she had survived those first winter years. She put her hand on his hair and said nothing and drew away from the light that was not light. Morning brought the ordinary moves that make up a life interrupted by what ought to be extraordinary. Men came to see him and to judge. Letters came, one with a seal pink and broken. He could smell bacon from the kitchen and watered ale and the cold metallic tang of new-forged nails. He walked the yard and tested his shoulder and watched the hand in the chest do nothing until he let his mind go and then watched it begin to tap again like a bored man at a table. He held Longclaw and set aside the sense that the sword was watching him as much as he watched the sword. Sometime after midday, as the light grew the flatter kind that passed for afternoon this far north, they brought him the letter that smelled faintly of rose oil and damp wool, two scents that did not belong together in this place. Sansa's hand had been firm but not steady, the good lines preserved while the ink told the story of the shaking of her wrist. She told him what she had done and endured and escaped. She told him Winterfell was taken by a man who had made cruelty into a hobby, and then into a craft, and then into an art. She did not mention the horror directly, as the worst letters never do. The letter did not ask him anything. It did not need to. He felt the weight of it drop into him the way a heavy thing dropped into a waiting hollow. "Where?" he asked, his voice low enough that only Ed and Tormund and the Onion Knight and the Red Woman would hear. "Far," Ed said. "And near. She's within the north now. If my reading of the lines between her lines is any good. Tormund snorted. I don't blame your sister for running. This bastard of the Dreadfort skinned my friend and made his skin sing. I will eat a long feast when his head meets the snow. Davos watched Jon's face as men watch an important stone for cracks. Do we ride? Jon looked to the wall. He could have looked to a map. The choice sat at the crossroads of his life, that way maps always lie and dust up what matters and show the roads as if they were the point. He held both obligations, one in each hand. The old one that said the Night's Watch is for the wall and nothing of the south, and the thin new line that tied him to something beyond the wall that was learning his name. He thought of Sansa's letter and what had been done to those who had been promised his protection by blood if not by law. Melisandre broke what might have become a long silence with a sentence soft as fur. Fire has enemies to the north and friends in the south. The Lord's eye falls where it chooses. He put you back in the world not to set you on a bench and make you watch while it burns. Jon had learned to mistrust prophecy as a way of setting aside responsibility. Yet he also knew that sometimes a tide did lift a boat, whether the boat thought itself important or not. He put his hand flat on the table, palm down, and felt the grain like a line in the world. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat and found the rope that tied him now to the far winter shapes. Wait, he told them. Hold. Do not move. There was an answer. It was not obedience as men have it, but it was a recognition. It was the cold equivalent of honor. We ride for Winterfell, he said, and saying it relieved something in him and tightened something else. But before we do, I go beyond the wall. To do what? Ed asked, half knowing from the way the air had changed. To speak, Jon said. To who? To what commands them? Jon said, and his mouth was dry. He realized then there would be no turning from the strangeness. He had taken something in with his second breath that set his path. He could not go to Winterfell with a half-made bargain at his back. They chose a small party for the going. Tormund would not be left out, and Jon did not want him out. It came because Ed always came. Davos argued himself into the company because he feared what Jon might give away in exchange for his sister and his north, and because he had a shipman's understanding that storms did not often give their cargo back whole. Melisandre came because any place where cold wrote its own law was a place she wanted to stand and contradict. The day they chose had a clear air that made objects far away seem near and false-sized. They took the east gate toward the sea. The ice there was new enough that the old builder's work still looked clean, and Jon could taste the old spells in the frame of the gate like salt left on a board after a boiled fish. Beyond the wall the plains stretched in long folds where blown snow made dunes that resettled themselves as men watched. The sky held light somewhere above layers of cloud, as if the gods had set another world atop this one, and that world was brighter. They did not go far, at first, only into the first pocket where a stand of dead trees made a warren, and any ambush must be airy and unlikely. They made a circle and stood within it. Tormund had his great hafted axe leaning on his shoulder. Davos wore a short sword and looked as if he knew it for a poor substitute for a boat. Ed had a spear he had bound and rebound himself and was trying not to think about who had once clutched the head of it. Melisandre stood with her palms open as if to feel the heat flee them. Jon closed his eyes. He found again the shape of the web. It was easier now. Came as if it had been waiting as well. He was not sure if that comforted him or not. Come, he sent. It was not a summons meant for the many. He fashioned it like a name and let it drift outward, concentrated, like a scent released from a folded cloth. The cold responded. Its response was quiet. A hush fell on the low, windy sounds. Even Tormund's breath seemed to hesitate in the air. Jon's tongue went numb at the tip. The hairs on his forearms lifted. They came like weather. He had seen them before. Awkward glimpses between trees, a shimmer in snow like a fish crossing a stream just below the surface, but never in full and on purpose. There were three at first, spaced as if they did not trust each other's elbows. They made no tracks. What prints there were belonged to the snow answering them, turning to glass where their feet fell and then healing again. He did not draw Longclaw. Drawing a sword is an argument. He kept his hands loose. He put his mind in the shape of the law he had felt in them, but he set his own terms into it. He thought of the wall's song. He thought of the oaths men had once sworn to hold the long night back and how vows spoke to vows. He did not pretend mastery. He did not pretend he had made any of the law he felt. He would be a piece within it, if anything. The first of the others stepped to the edge of their circle. Up close it was a terrible grace. Its flesh was pale, not like milk but like the inside of a polished horn, and under the surface there ran thin lines like the veins of a leaf. Its hair was as thin as hoarfrost run in long ropes. It held its weapon like a musician holds an instrument. John did not look too directly into its eyes. He had looked once into windows full of night and seen his face in them. This would be the opposite, he guessed. He had no desire to see what he looked like in a window full of daylight. He inclined his head. A man's gesture. It meant nothing to it perhaps, but gestures are like smells. Many creatures understand them without knowing they do. The law within him met the law within the other. The meeting clattered the way ice shutters clatter in a wind. He formed a thought carefully, as one might set a precious thing on a shelf and step back from it. Stop. Wait. Here. The other's head tilted fractionally. It had no expression to read. The second other came a pace nearer, and John sent the same shape like twin copies of a coin. He felt both stop, but he did not mistake halt for surrender. The third watched him with the interest one gives an animal one has never seen before but that might carry sickness. Melisandre's ruby pulsed. He could feel her heat behind him like a shadow that burned. "Speak," she whispered, though he thought the whisper was not for him but for the fire she worshipped. John did not speak aloud. He had an idea of a word that might be heard. He had not made the word. It had been taught him in that other place beneath breath. It was not a name, but it was the nearest a living mind could come to saying the principle by which these beings moved. He shaped it and let it go. Listening, they said that strange unword. It was a chord without assent. He thought, "The living are not your harvest." He imagined for them what he intended. A picture of men and women and children passing winters that were hard and summers that were brief, and the long work of building and burying and birthing and binding, and how it was an affront to that work to pull bones up and make them walk. He did not believe he would change their nature. He only meant to set a border within which their law would not extend. The foremost other, he would think of it as foremost because his mind required such words. Perhaps they found such hierarchies childish. Placed its blade's point into the snow and let its hands rest on the hilt like a man listening to a thing he disapproves of and does not yet plan to refuse. Its head fed the pale light off it the way ice feeds light in a cave and sends it in unexpected directions. It sent back an idea. The idea was as old as the north. It did not come with a memory of faces. It came as a shape. Once there had been agreement. Price had been named. The price had bound the living and the cold. The price had been broken. When bargains are broken, law steps in. John felt the weight of the words, though there were none. He saw a man like Craster, though Craster was only the last echo. He saw offerings handed in secret to the dark and a kind of peace purchased, vile as it was. He saw the end of such offerings, either through a change of conscience or the death of the man that kept the practice, and the breaking of the pattern tugging the law in different directions. He thought of stones in a wall set by a mason who is long dead. Take one from the center and the pressure goes elsewhere. Men crushed perhaps who had not set the stones and did not deserve to be crushed. Davos shifted his boots. He would not have understood the conversation, but he would have known the feel of negotiation. Tormund resisted the urge to spit. Melisandre's breath came too slow. John formed answer. "We will not pay that price." It was the plain truth. Even if some would, he thought he would not. And yet he could not let the south tear itself for lack of a wall, while the north devoured the rotten heart of itself in old secrets. The cold offered then a different idea. It was compassion from their side, but it looked like cruelty from his. Said, "If you will take a roll, we will take a roll. The wall has a law, we have a law. Who will stand in the place where those laws meet?" The answer shaped itself in him without bidding. He feared it and welcomed it. The shape was him standing inside both. The idea did not come with the weight of doom. It came with the weariness of a necessary stone set on tired shoulders. He knew himself for what he had been made into, hybrid of fire and unliving cold. and what that meant to either side. He hated the idea the way a proud man hates his own reflection when it shows him as small. He opened his eyes and the world was banal again. Snow, wood, men, the red woman's breath like smoke, the rasp of Tormund shifting, Davos's nose redder than usual, Ed's damp hair frozen into small spears. The others waited like statues carved out of the absence of heat. "This is a bad bargain," Davos said, because he sensed the moving of the thought through the brittle air. "Name me one that wasn't made when two sides already had their hands on each other's throats." "It may be the only bargain on offer," Jon said, and he did not like himself for how calm he sounded. "What do they want?" Tormund demanded. "Me?" Jon said. "As the hinge between them and us." He almost laughed at the phrase. "Not as their king, as a gate, as a watcher." Ed blew air through his teeth. "A white gate, Snow. Well, the watch does need a new plank." Melisandre did not smile. She had no space for it. "A bridge burns both ends," she warned. "If you stand in ice, your feet will cool your heart no matter what you tell it." Jon had expected as much. He did not intend to give himself to the far law. He intended to write a clause no one else could write, that the dead beyond the wall would obey him within the breadth of his word, and the living on this side would in turn hold the old boundaries and not go north to dig at that old cold earth, and that the others would not cross the wall while he held that law in him and returned again and again to reinforce it. He turned back and placed himself within the cold language. It was like thinking and praying and swearing a vow at a heart tree all at once. He felt the old shapes not through him. Something in the wall answered in a low tone. He would learn later, from Sam's letters out of Old Town, that the wall's protections had always been layered. Not only old spells said by strange tongues of children who were not children, but also a kind of yearly renewing that had never been ritualized, that had happened shapelessly through the Watch's work in vows and nightly repetitions, through men believing enough. The Watch had fallen thin. The renewing had been poor. The cold law had found ways to creep its fingers between stones. Now another sort of renewing pressed itself down into the foundation. He said the shape. He made himself the place. The others did not bow. They did not clap him on the shoulder and call him brother. They stood. They heard. They accepted the law. The third other, the one that had not moved at all, took a slow step forward and lifted its knot blade. It set the ice things flat carefully against the side of Jon's neck. A man's pulse is felt there. Jon thought of fire, of the red woman's heat, of the law of life that takes itself as serious as law of cold, and he held both. The blade, no, not a blade, not iron, rested and then lifted again. The other took a small bone charm from within its scant trappings and set it in the snow. Jon did not understand the charm. It was a piece of the law. The second others turned away and vanished like weather deciding it had finished with this piece of land. They agreed. Davos asked after a moment in which he could not keep from crossing himself, unsure which god he meant to flatter. "For now," Jon said, "law bites more slowly in their country, but it bites." He scraped snow over the small charm out of instincts he didn't understand and then thought better of it. He left it in place. He would not play at their rituals. Tormund breathed out something that might have been a laugh. "Snow, if you were a tale, I'd call you a liar." He leaned near and shouldered him in a rude affection that moved Jon one half step and settled him into his own body again. "Now let's go skin a Bolton." They went back through the gate. As they passed beneath the heavy timbers, Jon felt the change lay in him like a new muscle he had never used and that now would ache for days. The men on the wall walk did not know what passed. They knew only that the wind had shifted and that their teeth did not chatter quite so fast. Ed left his hand on the gate a beat longer than needed, as if to make the wood remember him. Preparations for riding south began with an eagerness that was almost ugly. The free folk wanted revenge and bread better than what the Watch fed and a roof under which the building could begin again. The Black brothers who remained looked at one another across old lines of duty and found their faces impervious. A letter had come from White Harbor. Wyman Manderley would feed men who came under stark colors. Other letters came, thin and stiff, from mountain clans and the broken flanks of houses who had bowed because their necks had been forced to. Sansa arrived before the muster was ready. She came with Brienne of Tarth, who took up space in a room the way a large tree changes the line of a hill, and with Podrick Payne, who watched what Brienne watched, and with a small carriage that was mostly a shelter against the particular cold of the long lake road. Sansa's face had been a girl's face once, but grief and policy had turned it into a woman's face in a winter of months. She looked at Jon as if afraid he would vanish if she did not keep him held in her eyes. When she touched his hand, her own was warm, and the sensation ran up Jon's arm like water finds a seam. "You look thin," she said, "because what else could one begin with?" "You look like Mother," he answered, and it brought a small dangerous light to her eyes, and then tears that would not fall because she would not let them. Ghost came forward without any sense of propriety and put his nose in the skirts of Sansa's cloak and inhaled her thoroughly, and then huffed at Brienne, who stood a little too large near a wolf. Davos embraced Brienne as one sailor will greet another who knows different seas, and they exchanged the ordinary words that all such people have to be sure they are speaking of the same world. Weather, travel, enemies, road quality, food, the caliber of boys as they come grow now. Sansa and Jon sat near the small fire in the Lord Commander's chamber and tried to find a path through all the stories which had to be told first. Jon did not tell her yet about the thing that had changed in him. He would not hide it long. He just wanted 1 hour where she knew him without it. "When you write Manderley again," she said when the talk had settled into itself, "you must say I am with you. He will not hesitate if he knows that. He will not care that I am not." She began a sentence she could not finish and then stopped herself. "He remembers Father. He remembers the old laws. He will remember there is a Stark in Winterfell." Jon nodded. He did not tell her that the law he held now did not care for names but for shapes. He would make the North fit the shapes again. Then perhaps all such sentences would be easier to say. They set out under a sky that wore the pale sun like a coin shown to prove a debt had been recognized and would be paid later. The host was not so large as some of the southern ones. It could move quickly. There were spear carriers and axemen and more bowmen than once there would have been, because deer were scarcer than wolves and whistling a shaft had become the Northmen's truest practice. They cut across country Ed knew and Tormund knew in different ways. Brienne learned this land with patience, riding slightly to the side to not overshadow the men doing the Northmen's work. Sansa learned how to sit a saddle in the cold without freezing the very ends of her patience. In sleep, Jon held the law and held it again. The others did not press in those days. He felt them move around the northernmost ridges like sharks that had discovered there were fences in this bay and were curious how many times one might bump a fence before the maker came out of his cottage to see who's there. At the Wolfswood's edge, he sent a word along the cold. Not an order, a reminder of the law. He felt a ripple of acknowledgement, like hearing the feet of men on snow for a moment as they slow to listen to the night sounds. He would not bring White South. The thought made him nauseous. He would also not have the cold law turn the bodies they would make on the Bolton lands into weapons against his own. He made that shape, turning his mind until it sat correctly, and set it as if it were a low fence along the road. The result was not nothing. It was not certain, but the first battle would prove the strength. Battle is not poetry. It is numbers and ground and men making small decisions with heavy things in their hands, and then later someone writes a poem about it and makes it seem like it had songs in it. Jon planned as best he could and set his small host in a place where the snow's crust would break under hooves if you had to charge across a certain patch, and where a ditch dug by tired men would be invisible until you were in it. He set the mountain men on his left flank because they carried their own stubborn laws and would not run, and set the free folk on the right because they liked to move and liked to pretend they were not obeying orders while executing them perfectly. Ramsay Bolton rode out and put up his banners with the casual cruelty of a man who thinks their brightness is insult enough. He had men who had learned to obey him because not obeying had worse outcomes than death. He had dogs that were not worth speaking of in any law. He had a way of smiling that made men want to scrape their own tongues. He sent letters to Jon as they formed their lines. They were not real letters. They were small knives. Jon read none of the words aloud. He burned one in the little iron brazier and watched the curl of paper and the lick of a flame that looked wrong in daylight. He held Longclaw and looked over the heads of his men, and saw the shape of his enemy's force and the ground and the sky and the wind which decided to skate along the snow in thin hissings like snakes. The first clash felt like the dropping of a trapdoor. It was less ordered than any of them had meant it to be. A rider fell on the wrong side of something and his horse half crushed him, and his friend had to choose whether to haul him out or let the horse finish him. He chose. That is what battles are made of. Jon moved where he was needed, not because he wanted songs to have him at their center, but because one man who knew how to put his sword into a place sometimes means 10 men do not die. He moved as if he were thinking with a tongue that touched iron and cold both, and came away telling him about the taste of fear. Ghost ran near him and sometimes away in swift white arcs that became red. An hour into the worst of it, Jon felt the law pushing. Not from the others. From the land. Men were falling. The cold had a habit. It wanted to gather them and make them move. Lazy as a farmer gathering twine because you might need it later. Jon set his mind against it and sent along the fence shape he had made on the road. No, he thought, and 10 dozen times no. Not yet. These are ours. The cold was not offended. The cold did not care. It recognized his law. Later, when they had their hands on the throat of the battle, when Ramsay's line began to sag like an old clothesline in rain, when the mountain men had made the left so stubborn the other side began to go around it and found themselves exactly where Davos and Ed had wanted them. Snagged on stakes under snow, hemmed by a copse they had thought was scrub. Jon caught a glimpse of Ramsay himself. He wore his smirk like a benediction. He held a bow. He was good with it. He put an arrow into a boy near Jon and watched as if he had put a coin in a fountain and wondered if a wish would come true. Jon did not go straight at him. He was not that kind of fool. He made the space around Ramsay smaller with men who would not give him back his arrogance for free. He watched Ramsay's face change as small losses accumulated, as the day turned into an account ledger whose sums would not balance his way. Ramsay was at his most dangerous when he felt control slip. He did ugly things to put his signature back on the world. It ended the way it had to end, which is to say less cleanly than you want and more cleanly than you fear. A spear took his horse, and a man held his wrist with a new seriousness, and a blade from someone who had baked the family's bread for 30 years got under his arm where his armor had a friendly gap, and that was enough to make a bastard of the Dreadfort remember for a half-breath that it is flesh after all that moves all these pieces. They did not let the dogs have him. They did not make a show. They hung his ban. Arrys wrong side up and burned them instead and put his body in a pit without glory where the worms could make work of it. Sansa did not come to see. She had an adult's respect for the way the dead can grow in the mind and stain what life you have left. They did not throw open Winterfell's gates with joy. Gates are heavy, and joy breaks easier than it lifts. They took the place back stone by stone. There were men inside who had hated what they had done and did not have courage to stop. There were men inside who had loved what they had done and did not have sense to regret. Brienne walked the yard with that careful stride of someone who could kill with the same attention she used to keep her feet from slipping. Sansa walked to the Godswood with a shawl that had been her mother's once, and in front of the heart tree she let herself stand for a while without anyone looking and without trying to make her face be anything but what it was. Jon went to the crypts. He did not have permission, but the dead do not ask to see letters of passage. He went down the steps carved so long ago and smoothed by so many feet. Ghost did not follow. Ghost waited at the top, uneasy, as if wolves do not like to measure themselves against statues of men who are supposed to be their masters. Jon carried a small lantern. The light set the faces of old kings into relief and then into shadow and then back into relief. The iron swords set on the laps told their own cold story. He knelt by the place that was Ned Stark's and did not have words. He had lived too long without calling him father, and now, when he might have, it had been taken away. He spoke anyway, but not the way men think of speaking. He set the law he had become into this place. He gave Winterfell his vow. It was not the Night's Watch vow. It would never sit right in his mouth again to say the words of that. He swore instead that the law he had made beyond the wall would not cost this hall and these people more than he could keep it from costing. He swore he would stand until there was replacement for him, whether in man or in spell or in a girl's mind who would one day understand old shapes, and he swore he would not allow the dead here to be touched by anything that would call them up. The swords on the old king's laps said nothing. He thought, for a moment only, that their iron lines looked more vivid than when he had seen them last. Then the thought passed, and he decided memory plays tricks. Winterfell filled with the deeds of taking up life again. It is more work to live after battle than to fight before one. The kitchen boiled until the steam made a small sky of its own under the ceiling. The smithy broke its own rhythm to fix what it could. A gang of boys and small men took on the clearing of dead brush from a corner of the Godswood where neglect and fear had made a tangle too like the world outside. Sansa set women to counting. Wyman Manderley became a topic and then a presence. He would not let another house feed these men if his house could feed them, and he had a cook who had built his whole life on the thesis that there is no such thing as too much pie, and a pie is a better apology than any letter. Jon slept little. In his sleep he visited the line he had drawn. He felt the others test it now and again. They did not come south. They found weak places and then did not press. The law held if he held it. He discovered, with a tired amusement that cleaned nothing, that this would be work, and not a heroic deed done once, but work like any other, to check the fence each day and see where the snow had pushed it 1 inch and set it back. News came from the south like weather. Men in the Riverlands were doing what they had always done, which was to take and oppress and attempt to make new laws with knives. A queen in the city wore a crown that men had opinions about. Another queen, far away yet nearer than any of them knew, had hatched dragons into the world that would eventually find that no law except their own fit them. Jon read and listened and nodded and returned to counting wheat and crossbow bolts and men who could be trusted to watch without falling asleep and boys who wanted to be men and must not be made into ghosts for that wanting. On a gray morning when the snow fell in a delicate desultory way, as if remembering how to be gentle, Samwell Tarly arrived. He had come from Old Town by ways no reasonable man would call reasonable. He had lost weight and found resolve, and when he embraced Jon he did it with arms, not with apology. Gilly stood at his shoulder, and the babe that had been her son, and then not her son, sat in her arms with a world-old frown. They found a warm room for them and then poured the warmth into it. Sam took out of his pack not only a sack of bread and a skin of wine and a second pair of socks wrapped in oiled cloth and little down feathers peeping, but also a packet of papers from which he extracted one that rustled like a dried leaf. He unfolded it. He had written notes along the edges as if arguing with the text even as he learned from it. "You look as if you have something that will cost me," Jon said, which is how he greeted Sam most days of their lives together when Sam came to him with that face. In the old texts, Sam said, "They speak of the wall's magic as woven. Woven of vows and woven of children's." He faltered, glancing at Gilly with guilt. "Woven of old magic. And it says, though it says it sideways so you'd miss it if you were looking for something sensible, that there must always be someone to hold the weave like a tailor's hand. It was never just words. It was never just stones and cold water poured until it set. It was a work of attention." Jon resisted laughing because it would sound like despair. "Attention? Like you keep the count of the stores," Sam said fiercely, as if the fight was with the men who would sneer at him always. "Like you keep a small child from toddling into a hearth. Not only by building the hearth well, but by watching the child and telling him no. And it says, too, that the Stark's place in this wasn't only to be good at war. It was to be a fulcrum." He looked embarrassed by his own voice.
"I'm mixing metaphors, aren't I?"
"You are," Jon said, "and I love you for it. Go on." The old kings, there's something in the material about summer kings and winter kings, but it isn't the way the songs use the words, Sam said. When winter was longer and worse, there was a person whose job it was to stand in the place where the cold law and the law of the living met. It was never said outright. It would scare people or make them worship him wrong. But he was there. He didn't order the others like a general. He held the bargain. He was the one whose attention renewed the weave. He looked up at Jon with eyes that had been bullied and now were only full of fear for his friend. "You died and came back. It makes you not the same. That might have been the door the old law could use to make you that person. You are of the blood too." Jon let the words enter him. They fit too neatly. He had already guessed. It helped to have it named in ink. It made him feel less mad and more doomed. "And if I choose not to do it?" he asked. Sam did not temporize. "Then the weave will fray more quickly and the cold law will make what use it can, and maybe it will be 100 years or maybe it will be this winter, but it will happen." "One man cannot hold a wall," John said. "One man can hold a door long enough for many to pass through," Sam said, his voice unexpectedly defiant. "Don't make me say it more prettily. I haven't slept enough for that." So he made of his life work. It was dull in the way that important work is dull. The men he set to patrols and the men he set to building, and the way he made himself walk the wall not for show but for the habit of it. When the wildling children made new games in the yards, he praised them and told them which of the big stairs on the east side was treacherous in frost. He talked to Sansa each night over bread and counted out the debts they now owed local houses and how to pay them without selling their pride too dear. He read letters and wrote back to them like a man who owes more answers than he will ever give and gives them anyway. When they had breath enough, when their new stores could spare men long enough to leave the usual measure of defense, he went again beyond the wall with a smaller party. He did not bring Sansa. He brought only Ghost and Ed and Tormund and Melisandre. He chose a different place where the trees stood like burned bones and the snow had worn hard and flat. He did not summon. They came as weather does when weather has made a habit of a place. He set into the snow a small arrangement of iron and wood that Sam had told him was used once to teach boys to judge wind. It would do for another law now. He placed 2 river stones he had carried from Winterfell, old and dark and worn smooth by other hands. He made in his mind the 2 laws cross over one another like threads and then fed them through him as if he were a shuttle on a loom. The others watched. It was biting work. He trembled, and Melisandre set her hand in the small of his back without touching, the heat of it a little bulwark, and whispered words she believed would call her God. He was a bridge between them and she was a small fire behind him. It would do. He learned that day he could shape command to the lesser cold, that he could not only refuse to let the dead rise but also tell one who had risen to lay down. He hated it. He was glad to learn it. Contradictions became his life. It was after that second parley that the ravens brought word of another queen, Daenerys, the Dragon Queen, having put her foot on Westeros' soil after so many seasons far away. The gods had a sense of humor. Fire and ice had written their own stories. Now they would learn to argue on the same page. "So," Sansa said at supper, looking like Mother and not at all like Mother, being herself entirely, "we must learn to dance with dragons and with snow shadows at once." Wouldn't Arya laugh at that? She would not laugh, Jon said. She would sharpen a knife and ask me how long I intend to be in one piece. Sansa's mouth did something small and dangerous. "Then stay in one piece. Use your law to keep the dead dead and your words to keep the living alive. If this queen comes north with fire, she will find the north already knows something about heat. We'll tell her what we must. We will not bow because she has wings." She spoke as if she had been made to bow one time too many and found the world not improved by it. Davos sent letters with careful phrase and attention to pride. He had a smuggler's understanding of what people could be made to pay and how to make them believe their price was a favor. Melisandre burned small things and read their ash. Tormund took to carving bone with a strange delicacy in the evenings, making little animals for the children to bring the children to him because he liked that, and by liking it taught the children to like him, which is how societies are made again. Bran's message came at last by a different path, as messages from the far west sometimes do. He sent it on the back of a boy with white lashes and a skin that did not feel the cold as soon as it should. The boy delivered his words and then went and slept at the base of the heart tree like a dog. He had a sack of mushrooms and a rope with knots tied at intervals around one arm, as if it had helped him count footsteps on a dark road. The message said only this: "The roots have your shape now. I can hear you in them. It is a good sound. Beware the white song. It is not evil. It is only a song that does not care for men. But it will not stop singing because we cover our ears." Jon read that and felt comfort and an ache both. He had wanted to keep one brother out of this. The world does not care had a man wants. It takes what it takes on its own timetable. Daenerys came to White Harbor, which was like her to choose a door that would vex King's Landing. She came with dragons and men who liked to shout and armies of men who did not know winters. She sent a letter that began with iron and ended with a kind of warm curiosity. She wanted to meet him. She had heard things. He wrote to her not as a supplicant but also not as a lord. He was a hinge and had made peace with the rot that the word had in it for a man who would rather be blade or wall. He brought neither Sansa nor Melisandre. He brought Davos because Davos was the voice a man uses when he wants to keep his temper. He brought Brienne because he assumed there would be men who would need to look at that much honor standing and be comforted or chilled by it. He brought Ghost because he could not leave Ghost behind anymore. The wolf was his last easy law. They met under arching beams in a hall that had seen storms and the breaking of storms. She was as she was whispered to be, beautiful and iron, a child who had grown into a queen by walking through fire and learning to enjoy her heat without going mad entirely. Her hair caught light the way certain metals do. Her dragons were dragons. No finer word. No whiffs. You are the man who died, she said in her greeting, not unkind, and her voice understood what it meant to say so and how it could cut and how it might also honor. And you are the queen who hatched her own winter, Jon said. She almost laughed and then did laugh because it was better than breaking any number of other objects at hand. You men of the north talk like old bards. It is how we keep warm, Davos offered. So then they made arrangements, and behind arrangements they made the shape of what might be alliance and might be ruin. He told her some of what he had done. He did not detail the language of the cold. He gave it to her as one gives fire. He told her there was law and that the law held because he held it. She did not call him liar. She did not call him king. She asked if this could be a trap. He told her everything might be. He asked her if she meant to burn what he had not fought to save. She looked him in the face and said she did not know him well enough to promise either way, and so would not flatter him or herself. It was bracing being told the truth so cleanly. Men had given him less and asked more. It seems the world has chosen two instruments, she said, looking not at him then but out a high window where a dragon's long shadow moved over stone. You and I. Fire has fewer bargains. It simply eats what is in front of it. I find that a mercy, but it does not know what to do with the things that refuse to burn. It learns, Jon said. The rest of us decide how much it learns at once. He looked down into the bowl of the hall. He imagined it filled with snow. He imagined it filled with flame. If you go north to fight a war I am already fighting, you will complicate my law. If I go south to fight your wars, I will fail the only task I can do. I did not come all this way to be told to go home, she said, but the bit of jest in it took most of the sting. I did not die to give you easy answers, he said. The words were out before he had decided to make them. He saw her decide to forgive him for the shape of it. They settled, for the moment, on an exchange of attention. She would send men who knew how to repair walls, for she had done it in cities of heat and dust. He would send men who knew how to keep fires from taking whole forests when lightning did its work. She would keep dragons south of a line he named and would bend that line only when she came to him to ask, trusting or testing him. He would not ask her to swear, nor would he swear to her. They would see each other again. He would show her the place where law meets law and she could choose to loathe it or admire it. On the ride back north, Davos made a few thoughtful sounds and then gave up and put his fingers in his cloak as if counting. Brienne rode as she rides, a guard in motion. Jon rode with Ghost's unease as a second seat behind him. The wolf did not like the idea of dragons drawn on maps near where he would run. Winter deepened. Winter is not an event. It is a slow rewriting of a world. Jon settled into his life as if it were a wound healed and a reminder of wounds both. There were days the law felt merely like an idea he had once believed in and now maintained out of stubbornness. Those days frightened him. If it was only in him, then one morning it might not be. There were nights he woke to the feel of the white song pressing at him like frost on a doorframe, listening for gaps. He would hold it, and sometimes he would lay out the names of those he'd loved. He would lay them as river stones and set the law on them, and it would hold again. Sam found with frustration and then glee and then frustration again a handful of texts in Oldtown's memory that spoke more plainly than any others had of the Winter King who stands between, and that such a man must never die a second time unless another is waiting with feet already in the ice and the law learned. John set himself then to find a replacement. It was not a task one speaks of. It is like making a will while one is still a young man. He did the work anyway. He did it with a patience that was not his. He trained no one to speak the cold, because the cold does its training itself in whomever it chooses, but he trained men and women in the habit of watching the wall and in the habit of believing that small dull acts hold up the sky. When he went south to Winterfell to do the other dull acts, the children began to call him different names. They called him the Snow Lord because he could make a snowball in his hand that would not melt and shape it into a ring and put it on a child's finger and make the child laugh. He did tricks because the children wanted try. CKs. He found that if he made the trick he could hold the law without making anyone else hold it for him. There came a day in the 3rd month of the new winter when the law went quiet. It had been a susurrus always, constant as blood. That day it was a stillness. He knew what it meant before he had gathered his men. He went to the wall and found its song had deepened. The others had learned his shape within it and decided to acknowledge him in the way weather does, by becoming what they are and forcing him to be what he had become. They came to the line. They did not cross. They came with their host, not with the old hurry but with patient certainty. They set themselves up like men besieging a city. They waited. It was a demonstration. It frightened the younger men and stiffened the older. John stood on the wall walk and looked down. It was terrible and beautiful in the way a storm seen from a cliff is. He felt the law pass through him. He held it. He did not speak. He did not order. He was a man on a threshold. He could feel the iron of the swords in the crypts more clearly than he should. He could feel Sansa at the heart tree, her hand on the bark, steadying herself against a wind she could not feel in the Godswood. He could feel Daenerys far to the south tilting her face to a dragon's belly and then choosing to unchain it. And he could feel the boy in the village beyond the white knife practicing with a stick and pretending to be he who stands. The day passed. They stayed. The night came. He held. Melisandre stood near and sang to fire in a language of heat. Tormund told a rude story the 3rd hour past dark to make one of the young men forget for a moment that his brother was down there in his 10th day of being something else. Ed complained of the wind in a way that made men grin. The others did not move. When the pale morning broke, the law held as if it had always been such. They drew away at last, like water that has tested a bank and found its stone firm. They took their not footprints with them, which is the sort of riddle the North has always asked and not answered. John let go his grip only after the 3rd hour passed the last glimpse of them. He slept then not at all, but he lay down and let his body stop having to do the work of standing for men. Ghost set his head on John's chest and made the small sounds that wolves make when they smell their own dens and decide they are safe for one night. He dreamed after that of a blue-black sea under 3 moons and of a woman with eyes like steel who put a cup in his hand and said, "This is the price for holding all things lightly." He woke with the taste of it and could not say if it was sweet. The years to come would be long regardless. He had bound winter to an agreement, not ended it. He had made of his life a boundary stone. Such men do not go on ships to see new islands. They do not ride south for tourneys. They do not retire to marry and have 4 fat children and sit by a window and tell them stories. He would be the story. That was a different sort of life, and it would demand of him that he not resent it too often. He decided to teach the children small things so that the pieces of him that were still a boy would have a way to breathe. He taught one girl to string a bow quietly. He taught one boy to tell the names of stars as if they were goats worth counting. He taught one woman from a free folk village the habit of keeping 2 books, one for food and one for gossip, because each will save a host if kept well. He took Sam's baby boy into his arms and thought, for one guilty blink, of an old foul bargain broken, and then set that thought on fire and put it out in the snow and walked away. He went one last time to the crypts before the snows grew too tall to make that trip regularly, and he put his hand on the stone that had become Ned Stark and said the thing he had never said. "Father." It did not burn him to say it. He said it again. He said, You were wrong about what a man must tell himself to be good. You were right about where a man must stand. I am standing. The iron along the old king's knees showed no new luster. That would have been too neat. He lifted his hand. When he came out of the stair and blinked tears that were not only from the cold, he found Sansa waiting with her shawl and a small smile and an impatient anxiousness that she refused to show the men. They walked together away with their arms touching as if you could keep someone warmer by doing it. The north made a sound like quiet. The cold's law was no kinder than before, but it had acquired a respect for the one who kept it on its side of the fence. Fire flickered in the nights more often without devouring. Dragons flew somewhere like thoughts that will not leave and will not yet arrive. Children laughed at the shape that breath makes in the air and tried to bite it. Jon smiled without showing his teeth. Ghost put his head under Jon's hand and made a sound that could be mistaken for a sigh. He thought of the point past which the wall ran into the sea and the way ice groans when tide changes, and of the old word for a promise that is not an oath but a pledge held between friends. He would hold. And when the day came that his hand could no longer hold, another would stand in his place because he would have made it so, not by magic but by patience, which is the most difficult magic there is. On that night the white song came nearer than it had in months, as if to see if he still had the strength. He went up to the wall one more time and put his hands on it and let his breath fog and dismissed the fog with his fingers like a child would and shaped the old words in his throat without saying them. And the song slowed, and the vast chorus of forgetful frost gave a man-shaped thing a nod, and the winter did what it must and the men did what they could, and between them and only between them a world stayed built.